Hey, Mercy.
Hello, Mercy.
Hey everyone, nice to see you all. Hi John, very honored to have you in this room.
Yeah.
John, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Mercy.
Hi.
Welcome, Johnny.
John
welcome,
is here,
Maggie.
Glenn is here, nice.
Feel free to unmute if you want. It's going to be a discussion. And maybe we can get started. Should we wait another minute or do you think that this is good? Maybe I can start with some introductions. So thank you, Megan, very much for introducing us. Megan is with the West African Decentralized Alliance, and also Mercy is with that organization. We're really excited to have them as a collaborator now. My partner in this, Andre Villela, isn't able to join us, but I want to give credit to him. He actually put the slides together that I'm going to be showing. He's a professor in Brazil who focuses on doing simulations and modeling of social systems using principles of, I guess, agent-based physics model. And he and I originally wrote a proposal for Fund 4 called Diversified Voting Influence. And particularly why I was interested in this is that any society typically has a wealth distribution that has a distribution that's called a power law. And that means that there's a lot of people with a minimal amount of wealth, but then there's a very long tail, and a few people have many orders of magnitude more wealth. So when I saw that Catalyst was using a one coin, one vote model for its voting, but at the same time was definitely a community committed to diversity, committed to building a global, balanced, democratic type of system, I perceived that long-term one coin, one vote won't give the community a balanced influence. So Andre and I are taking a look at that in more detail. And I have to say, first of all, Andre is here. Hello, Andre. Thanks for joining us. This is Andre Villela. I already introduced you as a professor from Brazil.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for my delay. I was in the other one.
Yeah, and just rounding out the introductions too, Megan has joined us to help with our communication with the community, and she's a physicist, even better. So we're thrilled to have her on the team. I'm an electrical engineer who's had a long passion for math, physics, and science. And so let me dive into some preliminary results, and then from there we really want to open it up as a discussion. So I don't want to hog the discussion today, but we do want to kind of set the stage for what we're looking at and what we've found so far. So let me share my screen. And can you see those slides now? And you know, it's too bad. Let's see.
Yes.
And I'm just going to move things around on my screen a little bit so that I can present better. Okay, so I'm going to put it in a presentation mode. Does that should be easier to see in a moment once it loads. Okay, let me go back to the beginning. Yeah, so again, we're Diversified Voting Influence, and we're funded under Fund 4, and we have a proposal in Fund 6. So IRG has been very gracious in working with us, and they've provided data about the distribution of wallets that participated in the voting for Fund 4 and Fund 5. This is the distribution for Fund 4. And some things I want to point out to you right away is that we're using a log-based scale here. So even though this might look like a kind of sharp decay, this is actually stretched out over many orders of magnitude, starting from 450 was the minimum in these, and peaking at around 1,000 ADA in wallets. These are the relative numbers, not the absolute numbers on the y-axis. And then going out to wallets that have approximately 10 million ADA. And so because it's a heavy tail distribution, the median, which is at about 4,000 ADA, is very different from the mean, which is at about 10,000. And we're starting analysis on something called the voting power, which is the probability that your wallet would be the decisive wallet in voting yes or no, whether to fund a project. That's going to be skewed very much towards these larger wallets. And that's where the concern comes from, having a one ADA, one vote kind of process. And then we also have the Fund 5 data, and the distributions are very similar. So there's, at least right now, it's grown in size. There's more wallets. There's about a 40% increase in the number of wallets participating. But the distribution across the wealth cohorts did not change very much. Now, two processes that we've studied in more depth, and then we're also, I'm not going to talk about today, but we also plan to study generalizations of these models. But as a first step, we're looking at sort of combining two models that have been discussed quite a bit in the literature. One is a square root model, where your voting power is going to be the square root of the size of your wallet rather than the size of your wallet. So if you have 100 ADA, then you would receive 10 voting power. That right away gives you a much faster decay in the tail. And that way the voting power would be more related to the median of the original distribution rather than to the mean, which is quite a bit higher. There's another process that I originally thought was too complicated for us to consider in just a 3-month project, but the more I've learned about it, and I thank Andre sort of for bringing this to our attention from his literature search. There's a lot of merit to this, so I'm going to take some time today to describe it. This process goes beyond just kind of redistributing how voting power is allocated, but it takes another step where, rather than your voting power being applied to every single proposal and a voter being responsible for potentially voting on all the projects, which is up to 100 now, rather you have a budget that you have to kind of allocate in the same way you might think about investing across different options. And so rather than voting on all of the projects, you would probably concentrate your votes on the projects that you have the most knowledge and interest in. But it also has a property that forces you to be judicious about not concentrating your voting on just one proposal. So the way it does that is that if you apply one vote to a proposal, that costs you 1 of your voting power. But if you want to vote 3 times, if you want to give 3 votes to a project, you need to pay 9 of your voting power. It goes by a quadratic or power of 2 cost. So if you want to apply 10 votes to a project, that's going to cost you 100 voting power. So for instance, this person with 10 voting power would be able to apply 3 votes to one proposal and just 1 vote to another one. Now, for the Catalyst program, and this is just kind of a sketch, we'll be doing more work on this, and then I'm going to open it to discussion. You could think about this being applied to one category in the field. And so there are typically between 5 to 10 proposals, depending on how large the category is. It could be larger than that, of course. Maybe it's like more like 5 to 20. But just as a simple case, let's imagine that there's 5 proposals that you're going to choose to allocate your votes for. So a person that started with 10,000 ADA would have voting power of 100, the square root. And a person with 1 million ADA would have voting power of 1,000. And so the person with 100 has the option of voting between 1 and 10 votes on a project. And then the person with 1,000 has the ability to vote between 1 and 30. And so the key point here is that whereas the wealth difference is 100 times difference, so in the current process, you can think of that person with 1 million having 100 times more influence. And actually, if you go to this probability analysis about who has the real voting power, who makes the decisive vote, it turns out to be even more skewed than that 100x would suggest. It's actually a lot higher than that. We'll be doing that analysis next. But now, through this process of applying the quadratic voting, the square root square root allocation, and then this quadratic voting, the change in influence is reduced down to just a 3x difference. And I can go a little bit further. I think we will as we discuss this, but I think I've kind of outlined the basic ideas that we're looking at. And maybe I'll open it now to some questions. And I think initially, I know people want to prompt about the slides, but initially I'm going to stop sharing so we can just talk for a little bit. And then we can come back to the slides for more specific questions. So maybe if someone has kind of some general questions about the project we're pursuing, that would be great. Or what your thoughts are about what I presented.
I think we have some comments on our, chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's great. Maybe you could read off one of those, Andre. You want to pick one and read it? Or does someone want to chime in about their comment?
Yeah, you can comment about their comments. I think it's good. You want me to read?
Johnny, you want to go ahead because yours is very relevant. We have thought about this question, but why don't you read or explain your question?
Yeah, it's just we are thinking about this, and I am thinking about this. Full disclaimer, full transparency. I'm a enterprise architect at IO, so something I'm dealing with right now, right, as we think about this problem. So I'm glad the community is also thinking about this problem. I love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, one of the challenges really is around kind of like splitting wallets, gaming the systems, malicious actors, bad actors, that sort of deal. And I'm just curious to know.
So Yeah, so let me frame it. In the literature on voting, there's two basic ways that the system can be gained, and you have to have some controls around that. The first one is called fraud or a civil attack, where an individual splits their wealth across many wallets. So that's the biggest concern, because that's a fairly easy attack if you don't address it in some way. We think there's two basic ways that it can be addressed. One is that the Cardano community is moving towards a digital identity system. So if they do end up implementing a digital identity and that becomes part of the registration process, that would be one big step towards reducing that kind of civil attack on the voting. But I don't know that that's enough, because there's a second mechanism called collusion, where a group of people would decide to vote in the same way. And by colluding together, they could then game the system. Now, I'll stick with the word collusion, but I'll also acknowledge that, some communication and collaboration and, common views about projects is natural and is part of what you want in the community. But extreme cases of it, maybe we'll call collusion. In part because of both of these, part of our project plan is to study the correlation patterns in voters, between voters, and potentially use these weighting processes, not just on individual wallets, but rather on cohorts of wallets that seem to be highly correlated with each other. And one of the questions that we'll have to investigate, particularly if I look at the collusion part of this, if we have a weighting process that groups wallets into cohorts that are highly correlated, I think one important question will be, to what extent does that sort of help make sure that independent parts of the community have an adequate voice, and parts of the community that are sort of very tightly collaborating still have influence, but not dominant influence, versus completely independent people having the same opinion, and therefore being correlated in terms of how they vote. And I don't think that's an easy thing. I don't think we'll be able to separate that out, but we plan to do some studies about the relative possibilities of that and how to address it in the system. Does that help answer your question, Johnny?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Are there some other questions?
I'd like to comment.
Yes.
Actually, so and of course that we are also considering to develop another function to map the ADA wallet size with the voting power, where splitting your ADAs doesn't matter, So there might be some other mathematical transformation that preserve that. So we are also investigating this possibility, because this can simplify the whole process of trying to, do not incentivize people to split in their wallets. So yes, we are.
Yeah. Just rephrasing that a little bit. So given a particular tail decay in the current wealth distribution, you can map that tail decay to a particular power that might have special properties that would allow you to kind of balance, making the voting more balanced versus not incentivizing a civil attack.
Yes, and we need to remember the following. We want to incentivize people to have a lot of ADA in their wallets. We just want for these big wallets to not have the dominance of some decision process, So they will keep, they will keep their voting power, but we don't want them to dominate some decisions, inside the community. That's it.
I want to look at the question that Tommy has just posted, and we can get to other, or actually, maybe I see Len has his hands up, and maybe they posted something earlier. Let me go to Len first. Len, do you want to chime in with a question?
Yeah, thank you. What about a more simple approach, which you say that there is a maximum voting power regardless of the size of the wallet? If you're worried about millions of voting power versus tens of voting power, maybe you set it at 30,000 or 20,000 or 10,000. Well, and without getting into higher math, to just say that regardless of the size of your wallet, the maximum voting power you have is X. And I think you can avoid a lot of this complicated mathematical attempts that don't seem to be resolving the issue.
Yeah, this is a good question. In fact, one of the things we referenced in our original proposal is the saturation curves that are being used for the stake pool operations. In order to achieve the goal of having a large number of stake pools, rather than it being concentrated in a few centralized ones, the saturation of the rewards was critical. So yes, that definitely has merit, and is something we plan to look at as well. We're focused initially on these power law type of functions first, partly because we think they do have merit, but we also agree with you that ultimately simplicity is something very important to achieve.
And I have some comments about that. By doing that, we are like crossing a line, because if you max the voting power of wallets, if you have, I don't know, 50,000, you may split in 5 wallets to have 5 votes. So we don't want that. We want people to keep any wallets they want, and the voting power is not changing by doing that. And we also want to incentivize people to have a huge wallet. We don't want them to dominate the election, and we want for people to have different wallet size, also to have a good weight on the decision. That's it. This is our main focus on this research. And looking at those functions and how to map the wallet size with the voting power is a mathematical task that we want to tackle. That's it.
Great. Thanks for your question, then. Tommy, maybe we can go to your question next. Would you like to say it, or would you like me to read it?
I also have my hand up.
Yeah, okay, I'll come to you, John, just in a moment. Tommy?
Yeah, well, it's a bit late here and my daughter is sleeping, so I don't want to make a racket.
Okay, I can read yours then. Tommy writes, the issue is that some have 1.8 million, while new entrants all over Africa, for instance, can never afford anything close to that. What if there was a whole nother token airdrop to current Catalyst members and given to every new member who joins? This would naturally require a Tala prison or some other way to ensure the identity of members. Yeah, so this is a good question, and one thing you can kind of think, although the voting power is being given based on the number of ADA, the way the voting is being implemented, you can think about as being another token because it's being run on another network. So indeed, a voting token is kind of part of the system already. And the question becomes, how do you decide how many tokens an individual wallet should have? Now,
Kenrick, if I can just jump in really quick. So I think something to point out is that we're trying to find like the middle ground between just giving everyone one vote, because I think something the Catalyst community does care about is, encouraging people that have been with the community for a long time. And one way that you could arguably measure that is by having more ADA. Now, that doesn't work in every situation, especially when you start to think about, you know, different standards of living, like you brought up, and just generally what people can afford. And so I just wanted to highlight kind of that we don't want to go as simplistically as a one person, one vote to address that kind of community sentiment.
Thank you, Megan. That is exactly the point. Yeah, is that while we're concerned about giving too much influence to a few wealthy wallets, we also want to recognize that there is merit to the influence of having some dependency on wealth. We just want to be careful about how we sort of gauge and balance that dependency.
I think the idea is that if in the worst case scenario, you have a really good proposal that should pass, but some really motivated large ADA holder intends to squash it, you know, something along those lines, right? Something that, you know, the system is not behaving according to the game theoretics.
Yeah. John, you've been patient. Why don't you go with your question?
Sure, thanks. Have you explored at all the possibility of creating a random sample or a stratified random sample of all the ADA holders and selecting this sample where they would get together in person and make a decision that might be majority vote, but it wouldn't have to be, and you could avoid the problems of majority vote. That's basically the process we use to come up with the all ADA holders representative in the catalyst circle. Is although we weren't able to go out and pull randomly from everybody, it was anybody who wanted to be considered. That was about 60 or 70 people, and then we did a stratified sample from that, or a random sample from that. So I wonder if you've considered that as a way of getting around all these problems of majority vote and totally anonymous voters.
Well, it's an interesting proposal you're suggesting. It's not quite within the scope of our project. But I think my big concern is how that would scale. I think for the Catalyst program, in terms of the way they formed the circle originally, maybe that was appropriate and it seems that it worked, but at the same time, given the need to evaluate hundreds of proposals and to have tens of thousands, and potentially many more people involved in that process, I don't think a decision system that requires a small group of people to make the final decision is going to scale.
You are not limited to that. You could always come up with 2 or 3 or 4 juries if you needed to, using that system. But you can get millions of voters and still have a stratified sample of 100 or 200,
Yeah.
that samples what those thoughts are. So there would be strategies of doing it that way, where that group was empowered to have people doing preliminary analysis, or by having 2 or 3 or multiple 15, 20 such groups that would be looking at segments of the proposals.
Maybe one way I'll address your question is the following. As I understand the Voltaire roadmap, they are working towards something that's referred to as liquid democracy, where a voter has the option of either voting directly on proposals, or they could vote to have an expert represent their vote. Now, I think there's definitely some merits, and we use representative democracy all the time for a lot of different processes. However, if it's tied to this idea of one coin, one vote, it makes the centralization of decision-making around a few people, I think, even worse.
Yeah.
In this, we just have one more month on this particular funding round with our project, so I don't think we'll be looking at that directly. But if we do get funded going forward, that's one of the things I want to examine, because while having experts as representatives has merit and is ultimately, I think, an appropriate part of the future system, it also leads to the possibility of very centralized decision-making in terms of who really has power.
Right.
And so that maybe is the key. We haven't done this analysis yet, but there's a key concept in the literature that's referred to as a voting power index, where it measures the probability that you make the decisive vote. And one of the things that they've discovered is that in representative kind of democracies, that gets skewed very quickly, and is one of the challenges that comes about in representative democracy.
Right, and you're still talking about majority voting, and so this would not, you would not be, in what I'm saying, you would not be caught up in the expert centralization. It's something that's been being used in some places, like the state of Oregon uses this a lot now already. So it's not like it's a totally new idea. But I don't hear any research on how to identify random samples of voters, because that's the key.
We can make a note on that, Andre, and maybe do some search on random samples of selecting representatives. Yeah.
The problem is just you don't know. It's not like a jury call where you know who it is.
Yeah.
The people, the voters are anonymous, and so I don't know how to solve that problem. And I'll shut up now. Thank you.
No, this was great, John. Thanks. I appreciate it. Andre, do you want to go next?
Hello. So regarding the random sample set of voters, can we start collecting data not just on the amount of ADA wallet hosts, but also the number of wallets which voted for a specific proposal, for example? And the problem with identity, I think, is that somehow you can show publicly how much ADA you have, for example, but you can tie your identity to a wallet with 0 ADA, let's say, or with just 100 ADA. And then you can use that wallet to vote and create this this metric of how many people actually voted. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes. So I think you bring up several good issues. So one point is that we are working with the IOG Voltaire team, and they initially have just given us the distribution of wallets, but they are going to provide us with how each wallet voted.
But it has to be tied with identity, or
not with that. Well, yes and no. I mean, the process is on a blockchain, so it's open and public, and so it has wallet addresses associated with it. But we're not making, and we have no intent of tying that to identities. Now, I think there's a lot of issues that come up as to if in the future something like the Atala Prism digital identity system is used as part of the voting process. That opens up a lot of different possibilities in terms of how you would design the voting system. You know, and our plan is that, you know, we want this research to provide some guidance on what some good options would be. Did you want to clarify your question, Andre? Did I address it?
Yes, yes. So at least you will have the distribution of the wallets.
Yeah, that's taking a little bit longer to get, but they're working on providing that for us. And that will be part of our analysis, is how we plan to do some statistical analysis, you know, given this distribution, you know, what's the statistical analysis of how influence is actually actualized in voting on proposals. And then we want to compare that with the actual outcomes of Fund 4 and 5.
Yes, okay.
Did you have a follow-up question, Lynn?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I think there's a couple of points that are worthy of consideration. And first is that this whole voting system that we're trying to decide right now is kind of focused on, do we fund a $20,000 proposal or a $5,000 proposal or whatever. But the voting system is really going to be used to, do we hard fork the protocol? Do we change the metrics of the system? I mean, those are the issues that are going to go far beyond spending Treasury money. And so when we start to think about that, let's say the follow on to that is, as Friedrich spoke about in his first fireside chat with Charles, is that, you know, we want institutional adoption, and for Cardano to become to reach its stated goals, we we want institutional adoption, whether it's a country or it's a company. And those institutions are not going to bet they're not going to bet their goals on a system that can be decided by 5 million ADA holder voters. I mean, they need consistency. And so when we start to talk about this, I'm a little bit, let's say, prejudiced against the one when one wallet, one vote, okay, and more in favor of those people who have stake. I mean, if you think about who has stake in terms of the future, an institution that's trading in 10 million ADA for their business or whatever, those people deserve to. I mean, there's a pejorative word, whales. Sorry, those people who have the most invested in the system do, I think, deserve to have an outsized vote, not on funding a Project Catalyst proposal. And I think that's our problem, not our problem, but that's obscuring the issue about designing these systems. We're focused on, is a whale going to vote down this proposal or that proposal for $20,000 or maybe $100,000? The issue is, how will the community decide really significant things? I think Bitcoin has the problem of block size, or they had the problem of block size, 2 megabytes or 8 megabytes, and they were paralyzed by that. So those kinds of decisions are going to be part of Cardano's future. And so the voting system, we have to think more, he or she who has bigger stake in the system, not necessarily they're wrong by having a bigger say.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Len. And that is going back to our original proposal and the way we're thinking about the project, we agree that the issues you're bringing to the table are very important. And I can kind of even make it, sort of exaggerate a little bit to understand why it's so important, is that while it's important to bring balance to the community in the way the voting influences, you absolutely want to make sure that you're defending and securing the system such that someone can't, with just a small amount of ADA, purposely do something of harm to the network, right? And I think that's part of what you're describing when you talk about institutions making a decision about what kind of system they want to use. They want to have assurances about the reliability. And one way you get that assurance is by people that have a large stake in the system, protecting it. So those issues are quite important as well. I don't think it's necessary, though, for that to be done with a one coin, one vote model. That really turns out to be a very extreme way of allocating influence over decisions. Let me just finish too. The other thing is that there are different processes throughout the system, and each process probably has to have its own strategy for a voting process. So for instance, you were describing sort of the network parameters, and that currently isn't done by the Catalyst program. The Catalyst program currently doesn't have any influence over that. That's still controlled by IOG and its partners. The Catalyst Treasury right now is what we've been targeting as a process and looking at. But we also think that the designs we come up with could be of value to decentralized autonomous organizations that run on top of the Cardano network. And then each one of them might have a little bit different characteristics in terms of how they want to make decisions. Go ahead, Lynn. You wanted to respond?
No. It's just a point that I think in all of these discussions, we have to think out of the context of funding proposals, because we're talking about designing a voting system for Cardano. And that must encompass all of the technical and commercial decisions that will ultimately be made.
Yeah, Len, the word I use is the regulated entities, right? The entities that are, whether they're financial or governmental or whatever, that they're larger regulated industries and actors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. The only comment I'd say again, though, is that there'll be different processes within the system that require different types of decision making. So we're focused right now on the Catalyst process for the Treasury. Mm-hmm. The model may very well be applied to other things, but that's not our initial target.
If I can add one more idea, we're talking about representative in terms of essentially one man, one vote, or one coin, one vote as one extreme, and the other is equal rights. And I think that maybe we can just look at, I don't think this is necessarily the exact solution, the bicameral system that's used in America of senates, which has every state, and consider that every state being some kind of a constituency, has an equal number of senators. And in the House of Representatives, it's based on population, meaning how many people equate to one representative in the House. And so that there's two different houses, if you will, or bicameral units that have different, they have a check and balance on each other. And like I say, not to say that that's the Senate and the House is the right thing.
I want to get some other people into the conversation as well, Len. So Marcy, you had your hand up earlier. Do you want to comment, or did you have a question?
I think I did have a comment, but I think this is great conversation, and I have just entered into the listening mode because there's a lot of wisdom being shared. So yeah, I love this because there are so many ways to look at this. That it's what I'll say is that it's good that we're dedicating some time and thinking and resources to solving this very complex problem. Thanks, Kenrick.
And Aaron Hara. Have I
Yes.
said it correct? Introduce yourself first, Aaron.
Okay, I'm also a proposer for Fund 6 in the distributed decision making challenge. My proposal is Consens. It's a platform that a platform for discussion and voting. And I hope that maybe in the future, if we will fund it, or maybe in the next fund, we can collaborate, and our platform can be some kind of a sandbox or a test field for your equations.
Yeah.
I just want to comment that. I get the impression that your solution is it's making a good balance between these two in this scale, between one edge of one man, one person, one vote, to the only one coin, one vote that we have now. So we still have good incentives for people to hold more ADA and more influence, ones that have more stake in the system, but we are eliminating the gap between these two. And I wonder if there is, if you thought about a way to measure if this system goes again toward another direction, and the balance does not preserves, and there is maybe a way to add some factor into the equation in order to get the system, the voting system, back to equation between these two edges.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. I appreciate you bringing it up, Aaron. And there's an interesting way you can describe this. Part of the motivation around both quadratic voting and the square root voting, they came from analysis of representative government. And the problem they were looking at is the following, that let's take Len's suggestion about representative government, right? Where you, and I'm also living in the United States, so I'll use that analogy, but it could apply to other governments. Every state has a different population, but they're always represented by 2 senators. So so in that process, each senator has a very, very different amount of people that they're representing. And therefore, senators or people that live in small states have more influence on the Senate than people who live in large states, because people who live in large states, their vote is getting diluted. So what they were looking at is, how could you design a system that even though these unequal populations are represented by the same number of representatives, how could you balance that? And what they came up with is this process of either square root weighting or quadratic weighting. They're kind of similar and reciprocal to each other. So what I was thinking about as a criteria in our project is to think about it this way, is that maybe each ADA should have the same voting power, irrespective of what wallet it's in, irrespective of whether it's in a small wallet or a large wallet. So a person with a lot of ADA would still have more influence, but you would design the system so his influence is truly the amount of ADA he has. Whereas in the current system, what happens is that's maybe the intent in going from one ADA, one vote. But in actuality, when all of the ADA is correlated in one wallet, those correlated votes end up being extremely dominant in the way the final outcome is decided. So I don't know whether that's going to work yet, but that's one of the ways I'm sort of framing the problem and thinking about it. I have not been able to keep up with the chat room, so I'm hoping Andre or Megan is helping me with that.
Yeah, we are getting the ideas of the community. And we want to clarify to everyone, this is not a simple problem, So As we said later, we want to incentivize people to have huge wallets, but we don't want them to dominate the election. Like, yeah, with my wallet, I can decide for the entire Africa because I have way more ADA than them. And if you think further on this, you have a budget for voting. So every time that you cast a vote, the cost will increase quadratically. So it might be a better idea to, instead of giving another vote on this proposal, let me use this voting power another one. So it's a budget. You are on a market and you have to use it wisely. So what we are doing here is good proposals that have small backers, I don't know, guys that, yeah, vote for that proposal. This proposal will get approved because a lot of people is voting on them, and a very, a wealthy guy cannot just buy enough votes to change this direction. That's it. So, but we want to incentivize people to have huge wallets, but we don't want them to dominate the election. So the voting power is a budget, and we think that people will use it wisely, deciding to increase the number of votes in on proposal, which will increase the cost very fast, or giving votes in other proposals. That's it. So it's tricky. We are dealing with, carefully about those issues, and we are considering all of your suggestions for that. And thank you.
Following up on what Andre said, does anyone have questions specifically about the quadratic voting process where you have to, think about which proposals you're kind of investing in rather than voting on all of the proposals? Are there any comments or questions about that?
If I may comment about the quadratic voting, there is a challenge that must not looked away. And if we really move for this kind of voting of the user experience, because the current voting system is simple. It's not so simple. It can be better, but it's much more simple than thinking about budget and allocating it for different proposals from the common user, from the common token holders, not the whale, not something that fully invested in the system. You create more complicated voting process. So in building and design the user experience of this kind of system, it needs to be taken into consideration, not to reject voters that not so engaged in the system, in the ecosystem.
Yes, you are right. And this is also under our consideration. The process needs to be seamless for the user, and very easy. But we think that what we achieve by implementing this is way greater than any complication that may arise from, this budget style of voting. But we need to do it elegantly and seamless.
Well,
so
yeah, and Aaron, maybe this is something we could work on with you, because in particular, one of the things that's interesting about this is that I had that concern initially when I first read about the quadratic voting. It seemed overly complicated and difficult to understand. And that would not be attractive for a process that you ultimately want hundreds of thousands of people to participate in. On the other hand, it solves a problem that voters are already having, in that if I'm coming into the Catalyst program and I want to participate in the voting, I'm going to be rewarded. Well, let me not get into the rewards. I'm faced with the problem of potentially reviewing and trying to understand 100 different proposals. And that could grow to 1,000 or more. No individual user is going to have that capacity. And that's why there's this movement towards representative voting of experts. However, maybe there's a way around that, and you think about it more like crowdsourcing, where people go into a marketplace, and in the midst of this huge marketplace, they choose to focus their time and their votes on the things that are of highest interest to them, rather than having to feel obligated to buy something from every single store at the marketplace.
Yeah, that's
I
kind of like
greatly-
it's like a form of self-selected expertise based on cognitive bandwidth correlated with voting power or
Right.
voting budget, I should say.
Mhm, mhm.
I have a talk with, I don't remember his last name, a guy named Ro from Adagov. Are you in contact with them? Because they have a solution, I think, for the same problem from another angle. They're talking about an auction system that people can place bets over different proposals. No, I'm not sure that
I
I
have
can.
not talked to them. Who is it that you were mentioning?
Adagov guys, they are also been funded, I think, in Fund
Oh,
5.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, maybe we should
You know-
talk to them as well. Yeah. We probably should wrap up. We've been talking now for over an hour. I don't want to overdo people's time, but is there anyone else that feels like they wanted to contribute something that hasn't been brought to the table yet?
No, I appreciate you guys taking the time to think about this problem. I mean, I think
Thanks for the
ultimately
comments,
that's
everyone. And we are keeping a GitHub repository, so you can look into more details there. Our first report had an extensive literature search, and our more recent reports will start to have this analysis. Well, yeah, thank you, everyone. I think this was
Sure.
really perfect. Thank you,
Bye
Megan,
now.
for putting us
Yeah, no,
together.
thanks. Oh, yeah, no problem. I was gonna say, thanks everyone for joining. I think another thing that we'll do is probably continue some more of these type discussions after the town hall or possibly on another call setting.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, this was super. It's really helpful.
thank you.
All right, well, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. See you
Yeah,
next
thanks
time.
for joining us. All right.